Good afternoon, and welcome to Westwood Wealth Management's fall event. Today's speaker is Washington insider Dan Clifton, who's going to provide us with his insights on what's happening in Washington as we get closer to the election and really how the election's outcome might impact the capital markets. My name's Aaron Long, and I'm the head of sales at Strategas. Before getting into this afternoon's content, I wanted to thank both Porter and Leah for having us on today. It's really been an honor to have been partnered with Westwood Wealth Management for the past 14 years, and an honor to have the opportunity to join you today. Throughout the presentation, you're welcome to submit questions to Dan for Dan to answer. To do so, if you'll go to the control panel on the GoToWebinar screen, next to the orange arrow, you'll see an audio drop-down and a questions drop-down section. You can submit your questions there, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible following Dan's remarks this afternoon. So, Dan, this has been a year like no other. A lot to get through tonight. So why don't we maybe start out with, what's the current political backdrop here for the 2020 election?
Sure. First, I want to thank Westwood for having us be part of this event. We've been doing this for every election with Westwood for their clients since 2010. And although the circumstances are quite different where we are doing this virtually, I think the material of this election is as exciting as any election I've ever seen. I think it's important before we discuss what is happening in the 2020 election, both from a presidential and Senate race, we have a firmer understanding of the political environment that we were going into even before COVID-19 arrived here in the United States. As a starting point, the US economy has been going under a significant transformation since the global financial crisis in 2008. In fact, we would argue that the financial crisis has had such an impact on the US economy that the economic volatility that resulted from that has created political volatility. More specifically, the US economy has been growing about 3% per year after inflation for 50 or 60 years before the financial crisis. And when the financial crisis hit, the US economy transitioned from a 3% growth rate to a 2% growth rate and has stayed there for really the last 12 years. And you say, well, Dan, that's only a difference of 3 to 2%. What's the big deal? The difference is that the US economy today would be $3.5 trillion larger if we had been growing at 3% instead of 2%. And for the average American household, they would be $40,000 to $50,000 wealthier. And so as a result, Americans know intuitively that their standard of living is no longer growing at the same level that it grew pre-financial crisis. And if you're somebody who came out of college, let's say in 2006, and got a job, you've really never experienced a full 3% growth rate and the income growth that is associated with that. And so why do we believe that this economic volatility has translated into political volatility? Is that we have had 7 federal elections since the financial crisis, and the voters of this country have removed the party in power in 6 of those 7 elections. We've tried all Republican, we've tried all Democrat, we mixed it up, we rolled the dice with Trump in 2016, and none of those combinations have been able to get us back to that 3% growth rate. I do have to tell you that at the end of 2009 and into early 2020, we were getting very excited because we saw true and real income growth happening at all income levels as the US economy and the unemployment rate started to hit full employment levels. It was exciting because it felt as if we could be transitioning out of that post-financial crisis malaise, per se. And in fact, what happened was a month or two later, we got hit with COVID-19. which was essentially putting gasoline on the fire of this political volatility. And more specifically, we are now headed into 2020 with four transformational events happening at one time. We had a recession, a pandemic, mass protest, and an election all happening at once. Aaron, we went back 100 years to the modern political system and said, have we ever had these four events happening in 1 year? And the answer is no. The best we can come up with was that three of these events have happened in 3 different years, but never since 1968, 52 years ago, without even having 3 of these events, let alone 4 of events happening at one time. And so our point is that we're really in an unprecedented era of disruption here. And as a result, my sense is that the range of outcomes for this election are quite larger than we are used to. That doesn't mean who's going to win. That could be part of it. Maybe Trump has a surprise victory. Maybe Biden has a bigger victory than people anticipate. But it's less about that this cycle and more about a contested election. Does the House of Representatives vote to make whoever's going to be president next for the first time since 1876? I wouldn't call that the base case, and I think that's something that we could talk about tonight, but it's no longer a 0% probability as it's been for most of my 25 years in politics. So my belief is that the range of outcomes here are quite larger, given the unprecedented nature by which this election is happening, Aaron.
Well, so thinking about that, I can think back to 2016 and the polls and how they got it so wrong.
Yep.
So from your perspective, what's the framework that you and your team use to analyze the 2020 election, and what does it tell you about the outcome?
Yes, that's a good question. So I sat down with my team in late March and early April and said, this is totally unprecedented environment that we're in. We need a framework to better understand how this election is going to work. And really what we developed was a 3-part system for understanding the election. Those 3 parts are asking whether this is a referendum on Donald Trump or a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. By the way, that's the most important question for the entire election. I'll elaborate on that shortly. Number 2 is what's happening on the economy and what's happening with COVID. Nearly every US election is turned on the economy. And now you have this X factor of COVID. And number 3 is, let's face it, this is not a national election. California is not going to matter in this election. Utah is going to matter less. This is really about swing states and what's happening in those swing states. Donald Trump is losing in the polls by 10%, but he's losing in the key swing states by 5%. Almost the exact percentage that he was losing by today is the exact number that he was losing by 4 years ago before he started this big surge to come on and win. So I would ignore more of the national polls and focus on the swing states. Let's take each one of those 3 factors individually. Presidents get reelected when they are able to make the case to voters that they've governed well and that choosing their opponent is a risky proposition that threatens the gains over the last 4 years. This is why we ask, is this a referendum or a choice? Presidents want it to be a choice between them and their opposition. What do I mean by that? In 2004, George W. Bush was running for re-election against John Kerry after the horrific attacks of 9/11 were made on this country. The president was a wartime president, and he argued that if we change course now, it will threaten the gains that it has made on our national security and our homeland security if voters go with John Kerry over him. He made the election a choice between him and John Kerry. 8 years later, Barack Obama is running for re-election against Mitt Romney after the global financial crisis. And President Obama argued to the voters that switching course midstream would threaten the gains that the US economy have made since the financial crisis, and electing Mitt Romney would bring about the same policies that created the financial crisis. Barack Obama went on to win a second term. He made it a choice between him and Mitt Romney. This election, that's been missing. Donald Trump has not made this election a choice between him and Joe Biden. In fact, I would argue that Mike Pence had made it more of a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Nobody was talking about court packing. Nobody was talking about banning fracking until Mike Pence debated Senator Harris in the vice presidential debate. That's what I mean about a choice. Now people are talking about those issues. How do we know that this was really a referendum on Trump for most of the summer? What we track is something called the Gallup polling presidential approval rating. The president's approval rating is a far better indicator of what a president gets in re-election than the polling that you mentioned before. In fact, there's about an 85% correlation between that approval rating and what the president gets as a vote. For most of the summer, Donald Trump was below 40%, only hanging out with two other previous presidents at that level, Jimmy Carter and George Herbert Walker Bush. Both of them went on to lose. But what you started to see over the course of the summer was that as COVID began to wane and as the economy began to reopen, the president's numbers started going up. Tells you how big of an impact both economy and COVID are having over this election. In fact, the president got very close to where Obama and Bush were in their approval rating. That means that the race was beginning to tighten. He has lost some of those gains over the last couple of weeks with his performance in the first debate and with his diagnosis of COVID-19. And so Trump is sitting somewhere in no man's land where he is above the losers but below the winners. And this race will be determined by where it goes in the next 13 days. Does it go up? Because that means the race is going to tighten. Does it go down? That means that Biden's going to win by a bigger number. And I would argue that tomorrow, the debate will be critical for the president. Every president running for re-election gets slaughtered in their first debate of their re-election. That is true of Ronald Reagan. That is true of Barack Obama. That is true of all presidents. They're not talked to like that for 4 years. They lived in their White House bubble. They don't prepare because, hey, I'm running the country. What do I need to prepare for? And they lose. The critical determinant for presidents is whether they are able to actually come back in the second debate and prove to voters that they are up for this second term. That's the challenge for Trump. The challenge for Trump is to say, I am for lower taxes. He is for higher taxes. I am for opening up our economy. He's for shutting down our economy. I created a vaccine. In 1 year, by mid-year next year, the entire country can be vaccinated from the coronavirus. This is not hard. It requires discipline and maturity. And that's going to be the challenge for the president, to turn this into a choice, to really be able to motivate his voters and move undecided voters if he wants to change the race. And that will be reflected in his approval rating, which you can watch on a daily basis. So that's number one. Number two is the economy and COVID. The most controversial thing I could tell you today is that despite having a recession in the second quarter of this year, the economy is actually an asset to Donald Trump's re-election. How do we know that? Because we don't like polls. By the way, when I worked in politics, Aaron, the polls were great. 20 years ago, I'm dating myself here, but 20 years ago, everybody had a landline. Nobody was scared to say what they wanted. We kind of knew what was going on. That's no longer the case. So we watch polls for direction. We watch polls to see how Amy Barrett is doing in her Supreme Court nomination over time, but we don't really trust the polls. So we built an alternative model of economic variables to forecast presidential elections. It's very simple. the S&P 500, the US dollar, the growth rate of the US economy, and the president's approval rating. And we mix those four variables up, and they have predicted within 0.2% what the incumbent party gets in a presidential election going back to 1988. So it's pretty robust. And what that argues is that every election since 1988 has been about the economy. We recently got US dollar data going all the way back to 1968, which allowed us to be able to expand our model. And something interesting really happened, is that we realized that our model did not work in 1976, Gerald Ford running for Richard Nixon's seat, and 1968. The 1968 model was telling us that the Democrats should have kept the presidency and Richard Nixon won it. 1976, the Republicans should have kept the presidency and the Democrats won. What it tells us is that sometimes the election is not fully about the economy. And that is instructive for today's election. It could turn out that our model is wrong, but that model is suggesting that Donald Trump would get 52% of the popular vote in this election. Two-person vote, meaning he'd get 52 and Biden would get 48 between the two of them. I don't really believe that Donald Trump's going to get 52% of the vote. I actually think he's got a chance to win, but he's going to win with 48 or 49% of the vote, not 52. And that tells us there's something else going on. Would you know that I can take data on COVID-19 cases and I can loop that chart right over there with Biden's lead in the swing states? It's an incredible data point. And if we were live in person, I would have that chart up on the big screen at the Westwood, the way Westwood does it, and said, here it is. It's right here. And what is interesting to us is that when the president was diagnosed with COVID, first week of October, you saw a big spike in voters saying they were worried about coronavirus. That is voters saying, if the president of the United States can get it, I can get it too. Guess what's happened over the last week? That COVID concern has come down. Guess what else has happened over the last week? Biden's lead in the swing state is coming down. And so I call this the COVID-19 election. I see Trump's numbers getting better, and I see Trump's numbers getting better because for this week, people are less worried about coronavirus. That could change. You could have a big spike in coronavirus. We're seeing that in Wisconsin right now. Or it could keep going the other way, where people are like, we're learning how to live with this, and that risk starts to get reduced. So I actually think coronavirus is having a bigger impact than the economy. But if the economy was still in recession, Trump would be dead in the water. He's turned that liability into an asset because the U.S. economy is growing at 35% in the third quarter and possibly double digits in the fourth quarter. And voters are responding to that. We could see it in our data. That leads us to the third framework, which is what's happening in the swing states. President is losing the swing states by 5% if you believe the polls. The president was losing by 5% in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina at the same point 4 years ago. Everything went right for the president in the final couple of weeks of the election. In fact, the week after we did a Westwood event, James Comey opened up Hillary Clinton's emails for a second time and changed the entire trajectory of the race. Trump needs an event like that and a good debate to be able to get that swing state lead down to what we believe about 2 points. So he's down by 5 now. We would need to see 3% better before we say this is a 50-50 race or Trump has a slight advantage to be able to win on this on election day. And the reason why Trump has a chance to do that this time is that he's very aggressive on the ground with a ground game, and Biden has been very resistant ground game. So if you want to think about the race in certain terms, is that Biden is running an air war with TV advertising. I'm sure you see a lot of these ads in Texas. And Trump is running a ground game the way he ran in 2016. And that's going to be the big difference between the race, getting the votes out. I can tell you Republicans feel better because they're looking at the mail-in ballots requests coming in, and it's not as overwhelming for the Democrats as many people believed. The betting odds, which are you can bet on outcomes, moved to Trump in Florida today, which is a big move considering that he was down by a lot in Florida 2 weeks ago. So there is some signs of momentum. He could kill all that momentum with a bad debate tomorrow. And he really needs to give his voters a reason to vote for him. But that's the framework that we're using, Aaron. And when I think about it, that's a 60-40 Biden-Trump probability. And we would need to continue to assess over the next 12 or 13 days how that momentum is changing. The poll-based forecasters are giving Biden an 85% chance to win today, and the betting markets are giving Biden about a 65% chance. So we think Trump has a better chance than the consensus. That is all caveated and predicated on how tomorrow goes. I would also believe that there's probably some risk in the 60 Minutes interview that Trump did this weekend, given that there's been a lot of complaining about Leslie Stahl, who was the host of 60 Minutes. So, I don't know what happened there, but, even if Trump has a good debate, then he probably is going to have a bad 60 Minutes performance on Sunday, given the nature of what's going on.
So Dan, you referenced this in your comments earlier, but what are the odds you see a contested election, and what should we be watching for?
Yeah, so a contested election only happens if the race is close. And so I think it's very important for voters to understand that there's a good chance there will be a contested election if Trump continues to close the gap that we've been seeing over the last week or so. So I'm going to waste 7 minutes of your time walking through a contested election, because I do think that the chances are relatively good we're going to see some lawsuits coming down the road. Let me start off this answer to this question by saying that if Trump loses Florida, North Carolina, or Ohio, we will know pretty early on election night, and the chances of a contested election will fall to near zero, particularly if he loses Florida. There's not much of a path for Trump to win without Florida, and Florida starts opening up their mail and early voting ballots 2 weeks ahead of time. And so we will get a lot of those results right as the polls close. It's possible we will know the results of the Florida election by 11 o'clock at night. Now, if it's super close, 50-50, that won't be true. But if Trump wins 51-49 or Biden wins 51-49, we'll basically know on election day. And it's interesting, when Trump started closing the gap in Florida in September, our clients were buying volatility protection for the month of November. That is the exact right way to think about this election. And that is that if Trump wins Florida, that means the race is going to move up to the Midwest. The Midwest has less experience with mail-in voting. The Midwest has less experience with contested elections, and they have really bad laws in place that are very different from Florida, that doesn't even allow the state officials to begin to open up those ballots until after the polls close. So just by nature of the Democrats voting by mail and Republicans voting in machine means that we are statistically unlikely to know who won those Midwest states when they can be critically important to determining who is the president of the United States. Now, from that perspective, we have to do scenario planning internally in trying to understand how these outcomes can happen. And so we do a review of the laws, we do a review of the counting process, and we have discovered that there are red flags for both parties in this scenario where Trump wins Florida, North Carolina, Ohio. We know that early, and it comes up to the Midwest. In Arizona, in 2018 Senate race, the Republican won in the machine ballot, had a huge lead. And over the course of the next 6 days, that Republican's lead continued to get chopped down, and ultimately she lost. It was a pretty cordial process. What I would argue is that there's nothing cordial about Donald Trump, and that if Trump wins big on election night, he's going to be sitting in the White House with his Twitter account as those votes begin to get counted by mail, saying that the election is being stolen and that there will be lawsuits that will be filed in those states to try and slow this process down. I would note that the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that Pennsylvania can keep its requirement in place where ballots can come in after the election. You can only imagine the field day of that, of missing ballots just happening to show up on November 6th and November 7th, days after the election. It's the Republican side. I think what gets less attention is what happens on the Democratic side. And that is that there is a very high error rate with mail-in voting, particularly with first-time mail-in voters. The Democrats just told their voters to vote by mail. And then when we had the primary, we realized that the error rate could be somewhere between 5 to 8% of the ballots. Let me make this clear. Democratic pollsters are polling states, Biden winning the state by 4 points. They're chopping 2 points off that lead for the error rate of mail-in ballots. Let me be more clear. Trump won Wisconsin by 22,000 votes in 2016. The number of absentee ballots thrown out in Wisconsin primary this year was 23,000. It's possible 50,000 ballots can get thrown out in Wisconsin this year, maybe even more. And Trump is likely going to win, if he does win a state like that, by a lower margin than the number of absentee ballots that get thrown out. The Democrats' heads are going to explode when that happens. They are going to do everything they can to get those ballots re-entered in, almost like a hanging Chad from 20 years ago in the Bush versus Gore. So both parties are going to be aggressively fighting and filing lawsuits to their great advantage, and it could be happening in multiple states if this race is close. We anticipate that all those lawsuits will have to be resolved by December 12th. The electors will meet in state capitals across the country and cast their vote on December 14th. If there is no resolution by then, or the Electoral College ends in a 269 vote, then we will have to go to the House of Representatives and have the House of Representatives select the next president. Like I said earlier, this is not the base case, but it's no longer a 0% probability. And we've been watching the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, make investments in House races in Alaska and South Dakota in an effort to try and flip those states so that the Democrats control them. Well, why would she do that? The House of Representatives vote is not a vote for each individual member. Each state delegation gets the vote for president. And the Republicans currently hold 26 states, which means if the current makeup of the House stays the same after the election, the Republicans will have the votes to make Trump president by the House of Representatives vote. What is interesting about this is that the House votes for the president, the Senate votes for vice president. Depending on the election results, you may get a scenario where Joe Biden is president, but Mike Pence is vice president, or in reverse, Donald Trump is president, but Senator Harris is vice president. So that is definitely an interesting combination, something we normally don't talk about in election cycle. We don't want to waste anybody's time, but we've had to prepare for all outcomes, given the nature of what kind of environment we're in today politically.
This has been a year like no other. So Dan, my last question for you, and then maybe we'll open it up for questions from the audience. We certainly have a few that have started to come in. So tax policy seems like it'll have greater importance in the next administration. How do Biden and Trump differ, and what will the implications of these tax policy changes be?
So it's a great question. Let me handle Trump first, because I think that's a little bit easier. Trump, to his own detriment, has been talking about what he's done. Elections are usually about the future, and has been less forthcoming about what he's going to do. if I was going into the debate tomorrow night, I would be equipped with this simple talking point. I'm going to create a 2 income tax rate structure, 15% and 30%. I'm going to have a standard deduction where anybody who makes $50,000 or less pays no taxes. 2 income tax bracket, 15% capital gains and dividend. I'm for lower taxes. He's for higher taxes. That's what I think Trump's going to do in his second term. I don't know why he doesn't tell anybody. So I actually expect that you will get lower taxes if Trump wins. By the way, if Trump wins, he will have won after a Mueller investigation, after being impeached, after a recession, after a pandemic, and after everybody told him the polls are suggesting that you can't win. This man is going to be emboldened if he wins re-election, and he is going to get everything he wants legislatively, at least in the first year if he gets this. Now let's go over to Biden. Joe Biden is proposing a tax increase that will be the largest since 1968. This may be the 4th time that we've now compared today to 1968. But there is this complacency on Wall Street right now that Obama raised taxes, Bill Clinton raised taxes, George Herbert Walker Bush raised taxes, and everything was fine. Stocks can go higher. I just want to be clear. They proposed tax increases of 0.3% of GDP, 0.4% of GDP, and 0.3% of GDP, respectively. This is 1.5% of GDP. It is 5 times larger. 80% of that tax increase is aimed at people who make over $400,000 a year in income. They are taxes on income tax rates, capital gains rates. It would be the first time the capital gains rate has exceeded 30% since 1978. Dividend tax rates, an increase in the estate tax rate from 40 to 45%, and a change in the step up in basis when you transfer property to your heir to a carryover basis, as well as corporate tax rate increases, although the Biden campaign is now saying that corporate tax rate increases won't go into effect until 2022. Okay, fair enough. These tax increases will not kill the economy per se. The Biden administration are out there saying that they'll do more government spending than they will tax increases. From a macroeconomic perspective, it's going to be net stimulative, at least in year 1, before it starts dragging in year 2 and year 3. Second main point about this is that, let's just say we have a vaccine. We believe that we will have 330 million doses for a vaccine by June or July of next year, where every American can be vaccinated. And that is probably going to have a far more impactful event for the US economy and the stock market than the fiscal policies of the 2 presidential candidates. And by the way, I love when people want to talk about the election and stocks. I want to be more important. I'm actually telling you that there could be other things outside politics that may be important to the US economy. Clearly the vaccine. And if the Dallas Cowboys opened up their stadium, would you be more likely to go if Trump won, Biden won, or you had a vaccine? I know what my answer would be. It would be a vaccine. So I think the tax policies being proposed are significant. I believe that the chances of the individual income tax increases getting enacted are likely if the Democrats sweep in this election, meaning they have the House, the Senate, and the White House. I think there's basically little chance of those tax increases happening if the Republicans keep the Senate, even if Biden wins the presidency. And so I think it's imperative that investors and high net worth individuals begin to sit down with their advisors now, not do anything frank or rash, but really start to think about what's best for your planning in these types of scenarios. And one of the things that I would argue is that we're already seeing companies shift their behavior just on the prospect of these tax increases happening. You're seeing a pulling forward of merger and acquisition activity because it's easier to sell your company at a 20% capital gains rate than 40%. We have 6 active oil mergers going on at once. Not a coincidence given the climate change policies. We also expect that many companies will pay out a special dividend in the final 6 weeks of the year if the Democrats sweep. They're pulling forward their dividend income into this year. And so there are going to be important changes that happen if the Democrats sweep as companies and individuals start to prepare for those higher tax rates when they come into effect.
Well, Dan, that's a lot to take in. So thank you. We've got quite a few questions here, and what I'll do is I'll try to combine as many themes as I can and ask you, Dan. So we've got a number of folks who are interested in your outlook on the Senate. And not just that, but obviously, what's the likelihood of Democrats taking control of the Senate, in addition to kind of the Senate broadly?
The equity market, whether rightly or wrongly, believes that Donald Trump is not going to win the presidency, and so the focus now in the equity market is what's going to happen in the Senate races. Not only is this important for tax policy, it's important for energy, healthcare, infrastructure, climate change. All those issues are going to get a lot of attention if the Democrats sweep. But most importantly, the market really wants greater fiscal policy stimulus. And under a Democratic sweep, you'll probably get a bigger fiscal policy stimulus. I think about my presentation 4 years ago to Westwood, and I think about the outlook for the Senate at that time. The Republicans were losing in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and it looked like not only was Hillary Clinton going to win the presidency, but that the Democrats were going to win the Senate. What happened in the days after that, you begin to see Trump gaining momentum. And when Trump gains momentum, the Senate races begin to close. The first point that I'll say about the Senate races is that the direction of where Trump goes from now will have a very outsized impact over what happens on the Senate side. If you look at the current polling today, the Republicans are on the verge of losing 5 Senate seats and gaining 1 for a net loss of 4, which would give the Democrats 51 votes in the US Senate. Those 5 states are, in order, Colorado, Arizona, Maine, Iowa, and then North Carolina. North Carolina was higher on that list, but the Democratic candidate is involved in a scandal with text messages and mistresses, and you're seeing that race collapse. The Republicans are likely going to win the Alabama seat. So that's how you get to net 4. But for example, Trump won Iowa by 9 points 4 years ago. Let's say he wins by 5. He's probably going to pull Senator Ernst over the finish line and keep that seat. If Trump has a late surge in North Carolina, which is what we are expecting, just like he did in 2016, he's probably going to pull Tom Tillis over the finish line in that place. So I don't think it's a guarantee that the Democrats take over the Senate, given that the presidential race can have an outsized effect on it. But the Democrats have plenty of opportunities just sitting out there that many people are not focused on. Montana, where you have a popular Democratic governor running, Kansas, Georgia too, but I think the special election is one that's being watched. And the reason I bring that up to you is, let's say Trump goes down the rabbit hole like he did in his town hall last week, the final debate, basically implodes. That would raise the odds of the Democrats getting 53 or 54 seats and start to be able to pick up in those areas. It would be a collapse of the president, very similar to Jimmy Carter in 1980 when he ran against Ronald Reagan and Reagan had a big sweep. And so if that's the case, the Democrats get 53, 54 Senate seats, they're going to declare a mandate and they are going to get rid of the filibuster. And that means that they could pass legislation in the Senate with 51 votes rather than 60. And it would really change the policy outlook if something like that happened. The most bearish Republicans in America are the campaign managers for key Senate races for the Republicans, because they think that there's a huge drag on their ticket. By the way, 4 years ago, they were telling us the same thing, and it all turned out to be false. So these Senate races really turn in the final 2 weeks. Most voters don't know who they are. I can't tell you because we're talking about Senate races. We have data showing Senator Cornyn up 6, 7, 8%, and we think that that seat will remain Republican. We also think Trump is going to win Texas, despite polls showing it somewhat close.
Well, Dan, there's there have been a few incoming questions in regards to Hunter Biden,
Yeah.
and whether Hunter Biden is the Comey event this time around, and also a few references to a computer. Any thoughts, any comments on that?
First, let me say that at Strategas, we don't have the luxury of choosing one political party we want to win or lose, or one policy we want to get enacted. The market believes that Biden's going to win, so we spend a lot of time on what Trump can do to change the market consensus. As investors, that's what we're looking for. And so we spend a lot of time on what does Trump need to do, but that's not a bias towards Trump. When you start talking about Hunter Biden or Russia, you start to get very big feelings from both sides of very well-intentioned people. And so I want to be clear that I'm speaking as an analyst here. The first point that I'll make is that the media will refuse to report on the Hunter Biden story and prevent it from going fully viral. I did an event yesterday with a very prominent official at a very prominent network. Everybody on this call would know who this member of the media is. And he made it very clear to me that Rudy Giuliani has more questions to answer than Joe Biden does about this laptop. I found that comment to be striking, but as an analyst, I took that, internalized it, and said, the media are never going to report this story, ever. There are some legitimate issues that are being presented there, and those legitimate issues are about the nature of selling access to the US government, and in relation to denials that there's never been a conversation about business relationships. I also think that Donald Trump's tax returns, which somehow were leaked to the New York Times, are a legitimate place to have a discussion. One was leaked and reported, the other was leaked and not reported. There used to be a bias in the media, but it was kind of under the covers. It is so clear they don't even try anywhere. And the reason I bring that up to you is that Trump has to figure out a way around that. He can't just say, oh, you're bad, you're not reporting. By the way, most Americans are seeing it because they get their information in other areas. And, if you want to see it, you see it. I'm not really sure it's the issue that's going to turn the election for Trump the way the emails did for Hillary Clinton. When the emails did for Hillary Clinton weren't so much about James Comey opening up those emails. It was really about, God, we don't need this drama right now. We're so tired of the Clintons. It changed the race considerably. Here, you would need an event to go with that, which is the FBI opening up an investigation or something to that effect, or some smoke. I used to work in opposition research when I worked on campaigns. I can tell you there's heavy demand to drop opposition research right around the debate, and to have that research actually employed so that a moderator who's not going to ask about this question tomorrow is forced to ask that question tomorrow. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some big news is about to come out. I have no evidence of that. I'm just giving that to you based on my experience of working in campaigns. If Trump has something, tomorrow's the day. also the final weekend before the election. And what Trump is trying to do is mobilize his base with this story, get them out in large numbers, and his base really responds to this story. He's also trying to demoralize independent voters who are undecided, who are like, I'm not sure I want to deal with this. And so I don't know what's on the laptop. I don't know what's being said. There's a lot of people inside Trump world who are hyping up that something big is coming. And, I learned that there's these known unknowns. I'm not smart enough to know what they are, but we will be able to evaluate if something big is there. Why would you waste the big story 4 days ago? They should be holding something bigger that's in there now. And my anticipation is if we're going to see it, we're going to see it soon. Maybe as soon as we hang up this phone, this call, or we're going to see it the weekend before the final votes are cast.
That's great, Dan. There are a number of folks who have questions about the Supreme Court and what impact would having Amy Barrett on the court have?
Another great question. Thank you. Please keep these questions coming. I could do this all night. This is so much fun. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away on September 18th. And I viewed that initially as going to be very beneficial to Republicans in Senate races. Look at where the Republicans are defending: Kansas, Montana, Iowa. These are pro-life states where the Republican senators are struggling. This now gives them an issue to argue. On Monday, after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, I was on the phone with one of the campaign managers for the Senate race, and he says, this is killing us. Look at how much money is moving into an organization called Act Blue, which is a Democratic fundraising organization, and they're going to pump another 20 million into our state and all the other states. In South Carolina, the Democrats have spent $85 million to beat Lindsey Graham in that Senate race. Okay, so in a way, politically, the Ginsburg seat becoming open has really energized Democrats because they understand that they're already at a disadvantage for the Supreme Court. And a lot of Republican voters are like, to the victor goes the spoils. We're going to have 6 justices out of 9. And it just doesn't have the same level of intensity as 2016 with Scalia's seat or 2018 with the treatment that was done to Kavanaugh. What is most amazing to me is what has happened here with Amy Coney Barrett. 4 weeks ago, the polling was clear. The Republicans should wait until after the election to fill that seat. The New York Times poll yesterday showed 58% of voters not only believe that Miss Barrett should be seated to the Supreme Court, but that she should be seated to the Supreme Court before the election. This is somebody who crushed her confirmation hearings last week and has won the support of the American public to be seated before the election. So I believe that on October 26th, the U.S. Senate will vote to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. The Democrats usually wait until after the confirmation hearings and before the vote to leak out their bad information. This is where they went after Kavanaugh. This is where they went after Clarence Thomas. So the caveat here is there could be something there. We haven't seen it yet. This is where you drop it. The AP had a very long story about school boards that she sat on that have a history of discrimination today. So I would just keep an eye on that. Again, known unknowns. I don't know what those known unknowns are as it comes to this confirmation. But the senators have remarked that it took about a total of 5 minutes to read her background report from the FBI. It's as clean as it comes. She's a great person. And my sense is that she's going to be confirmed before the election. you probably see a lot of headlines about whether Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin are going to do a stimulus deal. It is like a roller coaster. It is all politics. Nancy Pelosi came back to the table for stimulus negotiations after Justice Ginsburg passed away. Because what Nancy Pelosi is trying to set up is a debate on October 26th that the House of Representatives is acting to help the unemployed, to help small businesses, to help state governments, to help airline workers, and the Republicans are seating a Supreme Court judge in the Senate and can't do fiscal stimulus. The negotiations have not moved in 4 or 5 days, and they're getting closer, according to the news stories tonight. They could have done this deal 3 or 4 weeks ago. My expectation is that there will be a deal announced between Mnuchin and Pelosi on October 24th. I'm just guessing, because the vote for Amy is October 26th. This is as amazing politics as I will ever see in my life. We have a presidential race. We have a very close Senate. We have a $2 trillion stimulus package, and we have an open Supreme Court seat in the month of October. This is the Super Bowl for what we do. I'm really worried about what the encore is for November, because it can only be really a contested election, and that's far less fun than what we're going through right now. But this is politics at the highest level, and I've never seen it anywhere like this, where you have all these events hitting at once.
Well, Dan, you referenced a contested election, and that gets to actually my next question for you. So this individual poses, a doomsday election scenario where Trump claims victory on election night, refuses to accept the ultimate results. So how do the markets react in that scenario, and what's the risk of open conflicts in the streets?
So I'm sitting at my office in Washington, D.C. I am 2 blocks from the White House. My favorite night every 4 years of the cycle is election night. The building that I am sitting in is literally burned out from riots and protests in early June to the unfortunate passing and killing of George Floyd. I am not going to have election night in our office, as is customary, for the fact that there is some risk of social unrest from both sides. And let me walk you through this. The first is that Trump is likely to claim victory on election night. His victory will be quite large if the voting by machine Republicans is true and the voting by mail Democrats is true. But if Trump loses Florida, I don't think that he will claim victory. It's only if he wins Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and it's clear that he's going to win. By the way, he's also going to have to win Arizona later in the night. And the scenario you play out means that he wins everywhere south, wins Alaska, but then the only thing open is the counting in those Midwest states. That's the scenario by which it plays out. The other scenario, which doesn't get as much attention, and we have reasonable confidence in, is that if Trump wins the Electoral College, and he wins despite losing the popular vote by 4 or 5%, we would expect unrest coming from the other side. The idea of withholding electors. This is not some fringe idea. This is an idea put forward by John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman in 2016. And so our internal analysis suggests that we have a real shot at unrest depending on what the election result's going to be. Before I get to your specific question, I just want to argue that in 2000, we had an unexpected contested election. We were going into a recession. I worked for a governor at that time. I wrote that governor a memo every week on what was happening in the US economy. I was able to go back into those memos recently. And what I found is that the US economy was clearly decelerating in July, August, September, and then we had a contested election. The contested election was pretty serious. On December 10th, both the Bush campaign and the Gore campaign had their own set of electors that they were planning to seat at the Florida Capitol, which is just a constitutional disaster if that happened. The S&P 500 fell 8% from peak to trough from election day. And through that whole process, by the time we got to December 14th, the stock market was down 5%. So number one, unexpected. Number two, going into a recession. Number three, it went on for 5 or 6 weeks, and the market decline was about 8%. Where are we today? Expected. We just spent all this time on it. That means the market knows about it. It means that investors are buying volatility to protect themselves from that event. Number two is I don't believe that we're going into a recession like we did in 2000. And number three, this is key. The Federal Reserve sat on their hands in 2000 and let this process play out while business and household confidence got slaughtered. They decided 2 weeks after the Bush versus Gore decision by the Supreme Court to then cut interest rates by 50 basis points in an emergency Federal Reserve meeting. I can assure you that this Federal Reserve will not sit on their hands if they believe that business and household confidence is being hurt by a contested election, and it threatens all of the hard work that our policymakers have done since the collapse from the pandemic. We have made amazing progress. We are not going to derail that over a 5-week uncertain election result. That's in a normal contested election. The scenario you played out is not a normal contested election. Trump refuses to leave. Trump will leave if the data is overwhelming. My belief is if Trump loses, he's going to take over Rush Limbaugh's radio show or start his own media network, and he ain't going anywhere. And my sense is that there's another life there for him. There are days where Trump acts the way he does, and I'm like, he doesn't want to win re-election. He wants to go back to his cozy life. I kid when I say that. He's a champion in the sense that he wants to win. But my sense is that his team will remove him if it's clear that he lost the election.
So Dan, maybe the last question. Are you surprised by the unprecedented numbers of early voting so far?
I'm not surprised by it. I'm encouraged by it. I'm excited about it. But what we were projecting was that the number of Americans that will vote will increase this cycle from 135 million in 2016 to 150 million this time around. That's a really sizable increase. We're getting close to full voting participation, and I have revised that number based on what we're seeing in the early voting. Is that we think now we're close to 157 million Americans will vote in this election. This is a major victory for American democracy. It is a major victory for what we are trying to achieve of citizen engagement in public affairs. When you do that, though, we're doing that by expanding early voting, by expanding vote by mail. We are giving up some of our security by going for better access. And that's very different than when I was in politics, where it was all about ballot security. Now you're giving up a little bit of that to get more people voting. And I think it's very exciting that so many people are voting by mail. Texas in particular has had a surge in early voting. And I think that's a testament to citizens being engaged. And what happens when you have events like a financial crisis or a pandemic, one that leads to shutdowns. I know I didn't leave my house for 6 months. Uh, Truly just something that I did not envision at the beginning of this year, nor did I envision that happening even as we saw China locking itself down, saying, oh, can you imagine that? Can you imagine shutting down Boston? And not only did we shut down Boston, we shut down every major city. But I have to tell you, regardless of the voting, the reason why I'm optimistic, we have seen the number of small businesses created have doubled in the last few months. We've always had the same level of small business applications for the last 15 years, and it's literally doubled over the last couple months. You're seeing entrepreneurialism from business owners that may have failed because of the pandemic, now that they're starting a new business. Unemployed workers realizing that the only path forward is to start their own business. Gig economy workers. We're seeing massive innovation in medical procedures because the entire medical community is focused on solving the coronavirus, and that we're going to have a vaccine in 1 year or somewhere close to that. The shortest time frame has been 4. The average is somewhere between 6 and 10 years. We've done it in a year. We believe that the technologies of that vaccine could now start to be applied to cancer and gene therapy. And we're having a major breakthrough in antibodies and therapeutics, where the Regeneron antibodies, which the president took, is showing people are up and walking out of hospitals in 3 or 4 days, very similar to the way the president has. So I'm very encouraged and looking at the silver lining that has emerged from a very dark event that has caused great hardship and is still continuing to cause great hardship on American families, American workers, and American businesses. But I do see a silver lining coming out of that. And America's best days are still ahead, regardless of what happens in this election. And I think the American voter is now fully engaged in US politics, which should help us deal with some of the bigger challenges from a health policy perspective or a foreign policy perspective.
Well, Dan, that was very well said, and an insightful evening. From everyone at Strategas, on behalf of Dan and myself, I want to thank again Porter and Leah and the entire Westwood Wealth Management team for having us this evening. I really want to thank you all for joining today's presentation. Westwood Wealth Management will be sharing the recording of today's presentation in the upcoming future for all of you, as well as those who were not able to make it today, or if you'd like to listen again or share it with a friend. So please reach out to your Westwood Wealth Management advisor with any questions that you might have. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your week. This will end this evening's webcast.